will be quite high. Whereas the ransom price for the slave I just described might be very low because he's a nobody. But if you're an old, like, officer or governor or official in Muslim territory, then your ransom price will be incredibly high. Right. Intentional use of slaves, getting into the real diplomatic stuff, what I wanted to actually talk about. So, using slaves for diplomacy. Ransoming slaves is in some way a diplomatic action because the amount you charge or who you sell them to or allowing them to be sold in the first place is all about opening communications with other countries and being nice and being friendly. Or occasionally not ransoming people to people that, and you can, very much this is used like that. So especially when the Hospitallers are trying to get agreements out of people. When the Ottomans have got a large number of Christian slaves that they want back, even their own knights that they want back, then the ransom price for Muslim slaves goes down, and they try and make an agreement, and you can use it for that. Often this was used very officially for treaties. So I've got actual dates somewhere. Yes, in 1475, the Sultan of Alexandria sends an ambassador to Rhodes and exchanges 10 Christian slaves for 10 Muslim slaves, and it's part of a truce. They mark their truce by exchanging these slaves. And for a while that becomes quite typical on Rhodes, where you would get a short-term 10-year truce, and you would mark the truce by exchanging a small number of slaves. Not enough that it's actually going to deplete your ships, but enough to show that you're friendly to each other. The Hospitallers actually reject a treaty in the 13th century that requests them to exchange all of their Saracen slaves for a large number of Christian slaves, because they'd have to free the Christian slaves, and that would mean they couldn't have any ships. So they actually decide that they would prefer to keep their Muslim slaves than free large numbers of Christians. 1635, to dissuade a pretender from the Ottoman throne. This one is a quite unique one. This pretender was named Sultan Zarchi, and he wanted to set up on Malta. And the Hospitallers couldn't exactly say no to the guy, because if he became the Ottoman Sultan, he had this plan to try and make an alliance with Malta, which is how he was going to get their support. But on the other hand, the Hospitallers don't want the guy there, because the Ottomans will invade them to get him. So they need to come up with a way of getting rid of him voluntarily, which they mention that they've got a large number of Ottoman slaves. And if somebody wanted to assassinate him, it would be really easy to convince some of these guys to do that. And it works. They actually mentioning the fact that they've got a lot of his people as slaves and that they could be used against him works as an excuse to make him leave. I think he also mildly gets the hint when they're coming up with excuses. Gifts. Gifts are very important. Anybody who the Hospitallers like or want to like ends up usually being sent a couple of slaves. So the wife of the Viceroy of Sardinia gets sent a couple of slaves in hopes of fostering a treaty to get some wheat sent to the island. The same thing happens with the Viceroy of Sicily and Naples. They get given a couple of slaves, just one or two, usually well-trained domestic slaves, as just a gesture of goodwill. The slaves to the Pope are far more numerous. So 1588, the Pope asks the order for 100 galley slaves in return for 100 convicts. The order tells him he can keep his convicts, and since he is the master of the Grand Master of the order, he can have the slaves for free. And in 1595, the same thing happens again, and the Pope is once again given 100 slaves for free to row his ships. Now the order aren't doing this just to flatter the Pope. In the 16th century that I'm talking about, they had some issues with the Inquisitor and the bishops on Malta. Whenever they wrote to the Pope and said, oh, the Hospitallers are trying to tax us, or they're trying to control our slaves, as a result of these large gifts, the Pope tends to be more favourable towards them. It works very well. The Cadi, the chief representative of the slaves. Now this is very unique. Well, it seems to be. It could be that it's happened in other slave systems, but in my research, this guy is quite unique. He's basically the union representative of the slaves. If the slaves have a problem, they go to this guy. He's an elected member of the slave population. He then goes to the master and says, we're really annoyed about this. And it means they have a communication going on. Now, the Hospitaller master isn't particularly bothered about that. The main use of this guy is as an apologist for the government. He writes to Muslim countries and says that the Hospitallers are treating their slaves really well. you should